Less than 10 seconds.
Hey everyone, Michael Unger here from the H.R. McMillan Space Center, here with a bonus interview for our Cosmic Night series in celebration of the Perseverance rover arriving on Mars. And we're going to be talking a lot about robots going to Mars, but for this bonus interview, I thought that we would get into something a little bit different, the ethics of going to Mars. And we have someone that has been thinking about this issue, and that is Erika Nesvold. Erika has a PhD in physics from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and has conducted astrophysics research at NASA Goddard and the Carnegie Institute of Washington. She created the podcast miniseries Making New Worlds in 2017 about the ethical issues of settling space. In 2018, she co-founded a nonprofit called Just Space Alliance, along with Lucian Wokowicz, to advocate for a more ethical and inclusive future in space. Thanks for joining us, Erika.
Great to be here. Thanks, Michael.
So let's talk about this Just Space Alliance. The mission on your website says is to advocate for a more inclusive and ethical future in space, to harness visions of tomorrow for a more just and equitable world today. So tell us about this alliance and how you became involved in advocating for space ethics.
So I got interested in this a few years ago, around 2017. I had been doing some astrophysics research because I was a research scientist at the time out in California at SETI, and we were being introduced to a lot of people in Silicon Valley who were working on the private space industry, people who wanted to go and mine the moon and people who wanted to build rocket ships like Elon Musk, which was exciting to me. But the more I talked to these people, the more I felt like they weren't considering some of the other issues we could run into in space besides just the technical ones. And so when I came back, I started this podcast mini-series called Making New Worlds, where I talk to people who are already doing the sort of work that will need to answer tough questions in space. So historians, sociologists, ethicists, and I found that really fascinating. And yet I felt like the tech world, Silicon Valley, the rocket people, again, weren't listening to the people who were doing this important work. And so I met Lucian Wokowicz, who was another astronomer who was thinking along the same lines at a fantastic conference that they ran in DC in 2018. And we decided to sort of formalize our interests into a nonprofit where we could connect these people who are doing work in ethics with the people who are doing work in rocket scientists and didn't know what ethics they needed to be thinking about, and sort of connect them. And we've been doing a lot of interesting projects on that so far.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive into some of those factors that you break down. I really love the podcast, Making New Worlds. For anyone watching this, if you haven't listened to it yet, it's available on all your podcast platforms. So, and you do go into each episode, kind of like delves into a different factor. So briefly, maybe go over some of like the big ones that you found doing the podcast.
Sure. So some of them are already issues today that we're trying to figure out. So one of the big ones is property rights in space. Who owns the moon? Does anyone own the moon? Does everyone own the moon? It hasn't really come up so far, but now if there's people who want to go there to the moon and mine valuable minerals out of the surface, then there's going to start to be competition over different patches of the land there. And so we need to start thinking about both the legal issues. So there's an outer space treaty that sort of dictates who owns the moon on the legal side, and that's still sort of under debate. But there's also the ethical side. How do we want to treat property that we can reach in space? There's been a lot of wars and bloodshed here on Earth over who owns land. Do we want to just perpetuate that in space, or do we want to sort of approach it from a better perspective? So that sort of thing's urgent. Another thing that I think is more of an urgent issue is labor rights in space. Mm-hmm. We don't have a ton of people living and working in space, but it's possible that as we go out and do mining activities and build settlements, we'll have more and more people working in space, but they'll be really far from any sort of protection for workers' rights. So for example, an asteroid mining company could put a bunch of miners on a rocket and take them out and just never bring them back, force them to work as much as they want. How are we going to protect those workers? And that sort of mirrors things that we're already seeing on Earth today with labor rights in the fishing industry. This is exactly what I just described can happen in the fishing industry, where people get hired onto fishing boats, they take their passports away, they take them out to sea, and they never bring them back. And so we can learn from the issues we're going through on Earth today to protect those workers in the future. And then farther in the future, there's things like reproductive rights and what happens when we want to start having babies in space.
Yeah, yeah. There's some really fascinating conversations that you get into. Well, let's go ahead and take it back a bit because you mentioned the Moon Treaty, which is something that a lot of countries signed, but I don't believe that the Americans signed it. Is that correct, or is it?
So there's the Outer Space Treaty of 19, which says that no countries can appropriate space. And that was written 1967 during the Cold War. And I'm actually impressed that the USSR and the US signed it at all, because it meant that they couldn't rush out and start this new era of colonization where they grabbed up different pieces of land in space. But they knew that that would cause a lot of conflict. And so they all sat down and agreed, we're not going to appropriate space. But that sort of left a loophole that we're seeing today, which is it doesn't really specify whether individuals or
Mm.
corporations can claim ownership of land. And there was another treaty called the Moon Treaty that tried to say no person can own the moon. But you're right, that's usually considered a failed treaty because none of the major spacefaring nations, including the US, signed that treaty.
So, what do you think the solution is? Do they need to create something brand new from scratch? Where do we go from here right now?
I don't have one single solution. If I did, I'd be talking a lot louder about my ideas. But I think more conversations is important. We need all the stakeholders to get together and talk about this. And when I say stakeholders, people usually think, oh, we should get the government regulators and the space companies, and they should work this out. But I think that when it comes to something like the moon, we're all stakeholders. We all should have a say in property rights on the moon, who owns the moon, how we share the resources of the moon, how we share the vision of the moon, because strip mining the moon could ultimately be visible from the Earth, and maybe we all need to have a say in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in your podcast, you go into all these factors and overlooking all of them are all issues that, are issues here on Earth as well. And the impetus to go into space, there's this underlying question that is why we're going to space, which comes up a lot in your podcast. Could you maybe talk about that big question and where things kind of like branch off from there? Because I think we get that question a lot when we're showing people about the wonders of space, and then when it comes to even robots or humans going into space, why are we doing these things? How does ethics come into play here when we ask that question?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really a super important question to start with when you're talking about ethics in space. Because if you ask a bunch of people who are advocating for settling space or for exploring space, you'll get a bunch of different answers for why they want to do it. And yet, the answer to those questions will determine the choices that we make in space in the future. So, for example, some people think that we need to be settling space because it's humanity's destiny and that we just have this internal, maybe even genetic drive to move out and explore and continue to grow. And those sort of people will make decisions that lead to more expansion, more growth, not necessarily learning how to live sustainably in their environment, because you can always just expand to a new one. Whereas other people say the Earth's not going to last forever, it's not going to be habitable forever. Someday, whether it's soon or far in the future, we're going to have to find another place for our species to survive. And so we need to move out in order to find a better home. Other people say it's just a bad idea to only have all of our eggs in one basket on one planet. If an asteroid hits us tomorrow, we're going to regret that. And so we should spread out just for safety reasons. And those people will make slightly different decisions, more about protecting the human race than about just conquering the universe. And so asking people why they want to settle space to get them thinking about those reasons is a great place to start these conversations.
Yeah, and we certainly do that a lot with our school programs and with our public programs, asking those questions, which is something what as our organization, as a space center, we do great. We ask questions, we talk about these questions with the public, but when it comes to actual like tangible solutions, is there anything we can do right now besides just have conversations, or is that sort of like where we need to sit right now? We just need to bring in more people into the conversation.
Conversations are a huge component of this. And I mean, it's easy to say because it's the easiest, cheapest thing to do is have more conversations. But the most important thing, as you mentioned, about these conversations is that everyone needs to come to the table, not just the people who have a bunch of money in their pocket and are ready to build a rocket today, but the people whose descendants might be working in these asteroid mining sites 3 generations in the future. Or our descendants who might be looking at the moon 100 years from now and want to be able to preserve the moon that we're all used to instead of seeing a strip mined moon. So everyone, including people who will never go to space, should have a say in this conversation. So that's a good start. There's a whole field of space law and international regulations and treaties, and a lot of great people working in those areas that are actually trying to put regulations in place and work out these details before we run into trouble. So a lot of people working in space debris and environmental protection in space, and those are all really fascinating fields too. And there's a bunch of people who are working on ethics and sociology questions in the context of Earth who have maybe never even thought about their work in the context of space, but they've done all this great work already, and we should be using that.
Yeah. And now, when you made this podcast, it was a few years ago, a lot has happened since then, including, SpaceX really now becoming a major player in space. Elon Musk saying that they are sending humans to Mars. And now there was also a side issue of the creation of the Space Force, which a new branch of the government, a new regulation. So what has happened since you last made the podcast that you are new issues that you might want to delve into? As you say, I believe that you're going to be making a book from your podcast.
That's right. I'm writing a book based on the podcast right now, and it's much more work I thought it would be because, as you say, so much has happened since I made the podcast. I can't just write it all down into a book. The U.S. Space Force is a big thing that I didn't anticipate. I have a chapter, an episode of the podcast about militarization of space and war in space, which is sort of the center of so much science fiction. Star Wars, right? The Expanse, which is a show I've been watching in order to write this book. Just all sorts of issues. We'd love to imagine what war in space will be like, but mostly it would be terrible. And so it worries me when I see things like Space Force, just from the point of view of it means that people are really trying to emphasize the idea that we need to fight and for our defense in space, because it just extends this environment of war that we had on Earth into a new environment. And then, SpaceX and other companies have been ramping things up. SpaceX has been doing some really impressive work with rockets, but at the same time, they're doing things here on Earth that concern me about the choices they'll make in space. Tesla and Amazon are not known for their great labor rights or supportive unions, and that doesn't give me a lot of hope that the asteroid miners of the future will have good protections and unions. SpaceX right now is a bit of a controversy. There was just a piece in The Atlantic about this. The village in Texas where they're launching nearby, they just crash landed a rocket there in one of their tests. The village nearby, Boca Chica, Texas, the people there are starting to get pushed out because there's a growing launch site there, and there's a lot of vibrations and risk, and sometimes you have to evacuate the village. And SpaceX is trying to push these people out, which maybe you can say, okay, this is just one small town in Texas. Why should the rest of us care about it? But that means that SpaceX is really perpetuating this attitude of colonialism and pushing out people who aren't as important as them. I don't want to see that perpetuated in space.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good modern issue that you bring up. And you also brought up, science fiction, The Expanse, Star Wars, in thinking about, these futures that seem to have lots of conflict, lots of militarization in space when we see these science fiction stories, and probably is a place where a lot of us start thinking about these issues. And I know that you're a big science fiction fan, so where do you see science fiction playing a role right now? And do you have any favorite modern ones that you think are good examples?
Well, so I said before that there's already people doing great work in these subjects, and we could use that. And I meant ethicists and historians and such. But science fiction authors are one of the best examples of people who have already put a ton of thought into what our societies in space will look like, and especially what kind of conflicts we're going to face in space. I started watching The Expanse. It had been on my list, but I had to watch it for the book because so many people referenced it in the podcast. And it's fantastic exploration of how all of our petty differences and conflicts and priorities that we already experience today are likely to play out even larger in space. You and I were just talking about Kim Stanley Robinson's trilogy that starts with Red Mars. I'm on the second one, Green Mars, right there. And he's done a fantastic job of representing the different perspectives that colonists on Mars might have about whether they should preserve their environment or terraform Mars to make it more like Earth, and who should be in charge. It's just a fantastic exploration. I could quote whole parts of it in my book if I wanted to.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. And I was just listening to the episode about terraforming Mars, which is a whole, ethical issue. And Kim Stanley Robinson certainly spends a lot of time thinking about that issue. Before we leave you, Erika, you're also an astrophysicist and a developer for Universe Sandbox. Tell us a little bit about this company.
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is my day job. There's a video game called Universe Sandbox. The company that makes it, it's the only thing we make. It's about a dozen people on the team. It was created by one guy about 10 years ago now, named Dan Dixon, and he just wanted to make a really pretty simulator of gravity. And so you can have all these planets and stars flying around, they can crash into each other, but it's all based on real physics equations. So you can set up the solar system and see how the planets orbit around. And he's been just working to improve that and hiring more people to improve the simulation and the game for the past 10 years. It's available on Steam. And I'm currently the astrophysicist on the team. For my PhD, I did a lot of computer simulations of gravity, and so it's right up my alley, except that now someone else is making the graphics look really good. And I love it. I love teaching people about space, whether it's space ethics or here's what it would look like if the moon crashed into the Earth.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely going to check out Universe Sandbox. And for everyone watching, where can people go to learn more about you and potentially where this book and podcast are coming out of?
So the podcast, as you mentioned, you can listen to on the major podcast sites, but also it's got its own site, makingnewworlds.com, and there's transcripts of all the episodes there if you prefer to read them instead. You can also check out my nonprofit, the Just Space Alliance, at justspacealliance.org. We have a Twitter account at justspace.org, and I have a personal Twitter account, which is just at Erika Nesvold, my name.
Wonderful. So definitely go check out Erika. Erika, thank you so much for joining us. Are you going to watch the Perseverance landing on the 18th?
I'm so excited. I was just watching the little video on NASA's website about what's going to look like.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for watching, everyone. We will see you next time.
Thank you, Mike.